Waging Peace, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In the past 5 years, opposition to the war in Iraq has served to mobilize peace activists across the U.S. and abroad. But the anti-war activity is only one cause championed by members of a loosely knit coalition of organizations broadly devoted to peace. Issues such as the abolition of nuclear weapons, the global arms trade, fair trade, and the redirection of military spending for social needs all fall under the umbrella of the global peace movement. To help us explore how activists are working to impact policies of governments around the world, we're joined by a longtime peace practitioner. George Paz Martin recently retired as Program Director of Peace Action Wisconsin. A lifelong community activist, he continues his work with a number of national and international peace and justice organizations. George, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. And I know you're not leaving the scene, but we thought we'd take this opportunity to make you stop for a half an hour and do a little reflection on where things stand with the peace movement. And I'm wondering, before we get into the details of it, if you could take that term, first of all, and tell us what it means to you. What does it mean to be the peace movement?
Well, the peace movement, you know, people visualize one entity. And it's really a broad-based social movement. We, who you viewers know, we're in the mainstream. Peace Action, United for Peace and Justice. We're in the middle in terms of working on the basis of democracy and nonviolence, and working with national groups and other groups. But at the same time, there's within the peace movement, there are those that are more to the left and those that are more to the right. And you might visualize that as possibly younger people to the left who get the term anarchist approached, and then maybe to the right, maybe more the conservative and the faith community. But within that whole spectrum, I think it's one of wanting not to have war and to redirect dollars toward human needs. And I think that would be it in its most simplest form. Many groups won't take up working legislatively. You know, other groups won't take up corollary issues that are important, such as immigration, and as it's tied to the peace movement. So within that spectrum, I think, as we talk about the biggest group in the country, United for Peace and Justice, which I serve as national co-chair, 1,400 organizations, one issue everyone agrees on, and that's ending the war in Iraq. You know, our position on Afghanistan is going to be major discussions coming up next week as we work in New York. Many groups won't deal with the issue of Israel-Palestine. Many groups won't deal with the issue of immigration. Most groups will support civil liberties as it's affected by the war. But as you can see, there's diversity within the movement and various constituents that come together.
And so you mentioned a few of those issues that really draw people together. Are there other ones that you would add to that list, things that broad coalition can all get behind and say they support?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of supporting it as relates to the war, you know, one area of campaign is counter-military recruitment. And so as we deal with our men and women and the risk that they put forth, one natural thing to deal with is to stop the flow of going into the military. So that movement based upon high schools and colleges is very important, and that's one that has unanimity around it. Also within that movement, it's that of supporting current veterans who are involved in the struggle.
And I guess one of the criticisms of the peace movement has been it's so many organizations that are maybe too loosely knit, and that it's like herding cats, and that it's difficult to know to have it speak with one voice. How do you deal with that issue of wanting to have an impact and have a voice on a particular issue, but also respecting the differences that must exist in a group that large.
Oh, absolutely. And when we're talking about United for Peace and Justice and 1,400 organizations, 20 national organizations, and the biggest and very specifically working in certain areas, and then getting down to local coalitions. I represent the Milwaukee Coalition for a Just Peace, which is a local coalition of some 20 organizations here. So when you look at that wide spectrum of things, you look at various levels of experience, various levels of resource, various levels of size. And so, but it all comes back to the fact that we're going in the same direction and that we're using the same tools. And those tools are education, lobbying, and public witness. So within the scope of that, it's a tremendous effort to work democratically and clearly. And so, for example, with United for Peace and Justice, we have a National Assembly every 18 months. And we're meeting this December 12th, 13th at near O'Hare Airport in Chicago. And I love that because I've been one of the first from the Midwest to represent nationally. And to have it in the Midwest means that people can get in the car and drive from 12 states to get there. If we're meeting on the East Coast, not many people from Wisconsin or Missouri are going to make it. And it's so important to have that broad base of representation. And so as we'll have our assembly or convention coming up, we'll determine our priorities, during the coming 18 months and dealing with the sensitivity in terms of if McCain's president or if Obama's president, and do we deal with that differently. Also the continuing effort to build this movement. And one of the things that we talked about earlier, but there's a comparison as we talk about this war and the Vietnam War, and what is the peace movement within that context. And I think it's especially significant that it's 40 years later, 68 to 2008. And so there's been a lot of discussion around comparison. I was earlier in Athens this spring on an international conference just regarding these comparisons of movements and politically what was happening in the States here and what was happening in Europe and what was happening at the universities or what was happening within the Black Panther Party, which I'm a former member of and got a chance to talk about a little bit more than usual. But, as we look at this peace movement, where some of the things that come out are, well, the people aren't in the streets like they were in the 60s. But, we've mobilized more people than the height of the Vietnam War. We still gather together 500,000 people annually. And so the people have been in the streets. I think, there's a couple of differences. And one of the differences is just the media itself. And we thank you for the opportunity to be involved here. But for example, when we looked at the 60s, love and peace songs were number 3 and number 4 on the radio. You turned on radio and you heard Lennon and you heard the Mamas and the Papas. Today, there is no songs allowed with the word peace or war. There's a big difference there.
Well, it kind of goes to both the, I suppose if you look at those changes over that 40-year period, let's say, you have both changes in what the issues that have been sort of championed or advocated for by the peace movement, but you're also saying there's changes in the tactics too about how they do it. So it may not be necessarily songs on the radio or measured only by demonstrations in the streets. But you're finding other ways to work as a peace movement. Yes,
yes, and so our work in terms of Congress is so important. The reaction we get around the world is, well, why don't you just get a bunch of people in the streets and change things? Well, that may happen in Ukraine, but it's not happening in Washington D.C. And so our tactics have changed. And as a group 2 years ago, we had the largest grassroots lobbying day in U.S. history.
This lobbying day being you're on Capitol Hill.
On Capitol Hill, training, 520 some offices all at the same time. I mean, that is a whole kind of not different, but more greatly evolved and more sophisticated effort than what what happened in the 60s. You know, one of the things that's made a difference for us in organizing is the internet. And so if we look at a couple months ago, and the resolution about establishing sanctions and moving toward an embargo in Iran, and I'll tell you, peace action nationally, along with United for Peace and Justice, within the 10 days before the crux decision was made, really did a fabulous job in terms of mobilizing, getting our constituents on the phone and emails to our congressional representatives, so that decision not to move in that direction did happen. And we feel that that's so important, and it's not many things that we can claim, you know, victory for in terms of this struggle, but that was a very specific thing, and so important in terms of moving toward diplomacy as opposed to military actions. And it was witnessed the day after that decision, and Ahmadinejad came on network television to say there's been a difference in terms of U.S. behavior, and we'll work toward a difference in our behavior.
Well, I guess it brings me to looking at the responses to the peace movement and how that's changed, and what it is now and how it's been. And one of the responses you hear shades of throughout that period is, you know, it's un-American. If you're opposing the war in the 60s, or if you're making overtures welcomed by the president of Iran, or stopping military recruitment, that these are things that are against American interests. That's probably one of the strongest criticisms that's made against the movement. So how do you deal with that?
I'll tell you, one of the greatest influences in my life was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I was 10 feet away from him when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, and I was a teenager. And as I've studied his works, you know, my immediate response was one of his quotations when it comes up that you're not patriotic, you know. And Dr. King said that he loved America so much that he had the right to criticize her and the right to work to make her be the best that she could be. And that's what we are doing as citizens. We are working to make a better America.
And so how do you politically, when the political times kind of turn, as they have in the last 8 years after 9/11, of this sort of general state of siege, of maybe even paranoia about foreign threats, and we have to do whatever we can to stop them, whether it's wars abroad or it's curbing civil liberties at home. How do you deal with that extra level of threat? And we have about a minute before a break, so you may not let you finish your answer before we break.
I think as we deal with that extra level of threat, I think one significant thing is that 4 years ago, Bush called us a focus group. Today, we are a majority sentiment against war in this country. And we accomplished that in 4 years. During the Vietnam War, it took 8 years to reach a majority sentiment.
Let me hold you out there, Jordan. We'll come back to this topic after our break, and then I want to talk some more about some personal reflections on your career. We're talking about the peace movement with George Martin here on International Focus. We'll be back in just a minute.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about the peace movement with local, national, and international peace activist George Martin. George, we were talking before the break about dealing with in a society where you've had that extra heightened level of sort of threat and maybe a willingness to engage in foreign wars and curbing civil liberties at home. How do you deal with the individual? We'll talk about policy in a minute, but how do you deal with the one-on-one with the individual who says, you know, I hear what you're saying. Maybe I respect your motives in trying to get there, but you have to understand, we're at war. We're under threat. We can't afford to promote those values or to take those steps right now.
Well, you know, we mourn just as all Americans do the losses on 9/11. And at the same time, we look at how the rest of the world has dealt with terrorism. And it's been one of dealing with it as a criminal act, not as an act of war. And so there's a huge difference in terms of what's happened in Iraq and how we look back at that, and how much it's cost America, not only in terms of lives and blood, but in terms of dollars and cents, and taken away from real valid direction in terms of serving our citizens and the rest of the world. So how we deal with terrorism, again, you know, acknowledging that, and at the same time approaching it from a different standpoint, other than a military standpoint.
I want to, if I could ask you to think a little bit of a reflection, not on a career, because the career is still going, but when you look at the various places you've been working with the peace movement over the years, what's your lowest moment? What's the moment where you're saying to yourself, I've got to do something else. I don't know if I can continue to walk this road.
Well, there's a great level of frustration, and I think the lowest moment probably was the day that our Congress voted for preemptive attack, which goes against international law and our own Constitution. And the day before, we had surveyed all the congressional offices in Washington and through students at Georgetown University. And the responses were hundreds to one against going to war. Hundreds to one. You know, and to have almost our entire Congress, you know, vote to go to war. And again, I remind people, it just wasn't the Bush administration. It was most all of this Congress. And then to have them add on an addendum to that act of war to say that consumers could not sue pharmaceutical companies. It brings up the issue in terms of who do the majority of our Congress people really represent. You know, and so that's part of the whole issue as we talk about war and voting and bringing about change.
You mentioned sort of disappointments in the political arena, in the legislative arena. Is it sometimes frustrating to be feeling like, hey, you're working on what you really think is on behalf of the better interests of the country, as you would define it, as the people you work with would define it, and then you have a large constituency who thinks you're doing the exact opposite? Is that frustrating?
I think it's accepting a reality in terms of the parameters of what we have to work with, you know, and understanding that, and then working. You know, our role as activists is to educate and to move the public to affect our Congress people in terms of their decision. So, you know, I could be frustrated in terms of the overall of, you know, what gets passed and what happens or doesn't happen in Congress. But at the same time, my role is a much larger role in terms of how that ultimately happened. I can't look back to say, well, if we would have done this or we would have done that. I believe that it takes an awful lot. And so I've come to the point of not making a judgment to say this is better than that. Let's do everything we can. And
let's do the flip side. So what are there moments that you hold on to that, if you are down, that give you inspiration, that really say, hey, you know, this is why I do this work?
Well, I'll tell you, you know, I mentioned earlier Dr. King. And that first march on Washington, they say, was 150, 200,000 people. And as a 16-year-old kid, it was just amazing for me to sit there and look at that crowd. And now today, we organize twice as many people. And I get the chance to look at that crowd. You know, I get a chance to speak to that crowd, but I love looking at the faces and the responses, and, you know, to have so many people going in the same direction, wanting the same thing, is so important. And people say, well, what good are those rallies? You know, what Congress didn't do anything differently. You had 12 Congress people on the front banner, you know, and they had to fight to march down the street. So, but what it all comes down to is gaining more knowledge, more information, getting more motivated, and then everyone going back home and working harder to meet that goal, bring our troops home.
What are some of the accomplishments that you think about, whether they're recent or historic, about what the movement has achieved? And I know we're talking about a large group here, so it may be hard to pin down particular causation here, but what are some things that you say, hey, you know, we do make a difference?
Well, I'll tell you, you know, a couple things. One is when we went to war. People said, you know, see, what good did that happen? But for every day that we held up going to that war, there was less bloodshed. And I got to look at it like that. I got to look at it in terms of individuals, you know, in how that affects it. I also have to look at it in terms of the big picture. And so how do you figure out what's a victory, what's a loss? You know, it's clear, as we talked earlier, about holding up the sanctions. But one thing is clear, that the peace movement, which roots are in nuclear disarmament, and peace action was here in Milwaukee 30 years ago, nationally 50 years ago, founded around nuclear disarmament. And one of the things that we have done as a movement, not only peace action, but the other organizations and allies that we work throughout the country, is that we have stopped the funding for any new nuclear weapons research or development for 3 years. You know. And as we really look at what the greatest threat to us, our families, and our children, you know, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's nuclear weapons, and that's been brought home to me so much more strongly since I spent 2 weeks in Japan last month upon the 63rd anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you know, the fact that we were able to stop that here in the States, I think, is so critical. And at the same time, to understand the residual continuing problems. You know, Iraq, the Middle East is so big, but at the same time, to the people in Japan, you know, our nuclear vessels leaking radiation in their ports is the biggest problem to them.
We've got a lot more to cover, and we don't have a lot of time doing it. So I wanted you to touch on two aspects. We spent a lot of time kind of on national peace movement, some on here in Wisconsin, but internationally, where is the U.S. peace movement sort of in an international context? Can you kind of put that context together for us?
Well, I think in terms of, first of all, the war in Iraq. You know, we are most responsible in terms of our country, and Great Britain secondly. So it's the peace movements of the U.S. and in Great Britain who, as we work internationally, work with other countries. And I'll give you an example. The World Social Forum is an avenue for us to meet annually. It'd be very difficult for us to arrange and put together international conferences, but through these other vehicles, for example, in Nairobi, we met with the peace movements of 50 different countries. You know, we worked on the internet ahead of time and organized it, and we have what's called an anti-war assembly where we hear the struggles within each country, and then we develop a global call to action in which we agree and prioritize what we're supporting, not only the U.S. but other countries, you know, and how we move. So for us from the United States, as we work to end this war in Iraq, for us to have endorsement and collaboration of 50, 70 countries that have demonstrations on the same day that we do on that anniversary annually. And annually we have anywhere from 50 to 80 countries demonstrate along with us on that day to end the war. So that's really important, and it's also important in terms of those other countries as they impress upon their leadership, you know, how they feel and how those countries vote and how they operate within the United Nations around this war in Iraq.
I mean, it seems like the internationalization or the connection of peace movements in the world, throughout the world has been a big development in our recent history of the movement.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to now go the other way.
Okay.
So we've got people here in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. What does it mean? How do they get involved? How you said it's not just being in the streets. What else do people? How do people become involved in peace movement if they want to?
Well, it's getting connected, and whether it's to a Peace Action Wisconsin, or to the Candlelight Coalition in Wauwatosa, or to the Peacemakers in Racine, it's getting connected. It's getting connected so that one gets the truth, so that one has the opportunity to listen to people significantly involved. For example, Scott Ritter was hosted here last week, and he was one of the leading UN inspectors and brought out brought out the issues before we went into Iraq. And so to hear that firsthand is so important in terms of what people understand and how they make the connections. So that's on the education end. Secondly, to be involved with a network where you get the word that this resolution around sanctions in Iran is being developed, and call your congressman. And we call that an action alert. So whether that's done by email or you find that out at a meeting or a petition, again, that whole connectivity, whether it's 500,000 people at a rally in Washington or 500,000 people, you know, on the internet communicating with their representative, I mean, that's the significance of being connected. And also, there's this whole idea that I'm not alone. And to me, one of the things that has built this movement are the people all across this country who come out every Saturday, once a week, and go stand on the corner with their sign. You know, and people say, well, what good does that do? You know, but you don't know when somebody's driving by and they look at your sign and they say, yeah, I agree. And so they start to read the newspaper a little bit more, or they talk to somebody a little bit more. And that grows the movement. And so big kudos to everyone around this country, to people in small villages and towns, and it takes more courage to be an activist because everybody knows who you are, you know, to take that corner and hold up your position.
Well, George, Paz, Martin, we want to thank you for holding up those signs and being there for people, and I suppose they at least have one other person they can stand with on these issues, if it's no one else besides you, I suppose, but at least they know they're not alone, right? They've got someone to reach out to. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for your work so far, and we look forward to your future endeavors. To our viewers in International Focus, we'll see you next week, same time.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.